Thanks for the participants. On behalf of the Osservatorio sulle economie emergenti di Torino, the Center for Emerging Economies of Turin, and of President Professor Mario De Aglio, who unfortunately could not be present, I will give the chair to Dr. Maurizio Bussolo, lead economist of the World Bank, for the presentation of this seminar. Please, Maurizio.
Okay. Thank you very much, Vittorio, and thank you, Daria, for accepting the invitation. So I just don't wanna spend too much time in terms of introductions. Just a very quick announcement. Please mute your mic when you're not involved, because there are sounds. Everybody is from home, and there are sounds at times, so that's helpful. And we plan to have 35-40 minutes about for the presentation of Daria, and then some questions. And I unfortunately have a hard stop at 4 p.m. Your time. I think 10 a.m. our time in Washington. So those are some announcements. Now, in terms of what we're gonna discuss and talk about, probably Nobel laureate Paul Krugman has played an important role in shifting the focus of the analysis of international trade from inter-country focus based on comparative advantage to inter-industry to intra-industry focus. And the JVC, the global value change, is the natural next step, natural next big thing in international trade theory and research. And this basically means that we should further shift our attention to the real subjects of who does the trading, which are not countries but firms. And what does that mean for growth and for poverty reduction? In a word, what does this shift means for development? So this is the key question that the WDR, the World Development Report, which is the most prestigious publication at the World Bank, or every year at the World Bank, addresses. And we are fortunate to have Daria, a friend and a colleague, who is one of the best placed person to address this question. She has been at the World Bank since 2011, and in the International Trade Department first, which was still doing research, but more oriented towards operations and policy dialogue, and then recently moved as the research manager in the research group, managing a team of researchers doing work on international trade, effectively in all senses the equivalent of a full professor at the bank. And she has a very important publication in very prestigious journal, the American Economic Review, the Journal of International Economics. Her research has been featured in the New York Times and Forbes. So we're really fortunate to have her, and she was one of the main authors of the work. So without further ado, the floor is yours for the next 35-40 minutes. Please go ahead. Thank you for
Thank you, Maurizio, and thank you everybody for inviting me. So let me share the presentation, and while I do so, I just want to say that I don't mind if there are, I don't know how you want to moderate, but in case there are, questions during the presentation, that would be fine with me. Maurizio, you
Sure,
decide.
Sure. Let's keep it to
Okay.
clarification question, but let's try to develop the narrative. But yes, if anyone has burning question, please interrupt. Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay, great. So let me try to. Okay, does everybody see the screen well?
Yeah.
Okay. So without further ado, let me get into it. My computer doesn't want to get into it. Okay, so the motivation of this work. Someone is not muted. If in case I hear a feedback, just perfect. Thanks.
Yeah,
So
Adriano Greco de Fonseca is not muted. Marta, you were muted.
okay.
Go ahead.
All right. So when we did the World Development Report on trade 2 years ago, was the preparation. It had been 30 years that this topic wasn't covered in a World Development Report by the World Bank. In those 30 years, the scene of international trade has changed dramatically. And with it, one of the main engines was indeed the expansion of global value chains, which has continued unabated from actually the early 70s, when it was at 37%, and it reached its peak in 2008, 52%. But since then, it has actually, some say slow down, others say retrenched, but we definitely see a leveling off or a retrenchment of the expansion of global value chains. Okay. Sorry, I have a small technical problem. Okay, here we go. So why then 2 years ago we decided that it was time to assess this phenomenon? Because from academic work and actually also from our experience in operations, we could observe that global value chains have boosted incomes and created better jobs and reduced poverty in those countries that embraced this phenomenon. But they also had a mixed impact on the environment, and they brought inequality. And therefore, what we wanted to achieve was some understanding of how to use this engine, this strong engine for growth, to keep supporting development in developing countries, but by correcting the distortions that it has brought. And so the key message really that I will conclude at the end of this presentation is that actually global value chains can continue to support development, but there is a need for deeper reforms by developing countries, and industrial countries need to pursue open and predictable policies. And I will get to that at the end. But first, let me give you some of the insights on this phenomenon, what we observed. First of all, often people say that some countries participate in global value chains, others do not. But in fact, every country in the world is an actor in the global value chains, but they do participate in different ways. Some countries participate upstream in the chain with commodities, which then enter in many products of the world. Other countries are specialized in what we consider the next step in this path of development through global value chains, and it is with mass production manufacturing. Some of these countries then moved into advanced manufacturing and services, and then another set of countries, which remain for the moment the rich countries, are more specialized in innovative activities. So the other thing, the other starting notion is perhaps to just remind what a global value chain is, so that we all, have the same definition at the outset of this presentation. And so we can imagine that there are 3 countries. I mean, if we look at global value chains are a relative phenomenon, and we can look at them from the perspective of firms, as Maurizio said, but we can also look at countries, which obviously is the sum of the entrepreneurial forces in a country. And so if we stay at the definition at the country level, that is the one that perhaps is helpful to then connect it to development, we can distinguish between countries which like the ones that were engaged in commodities or on upstream inputs, they predominantly participate with what is called forward participation, meaning their product enters upstream in the value chain, and then many products that are produced by third countries. And these are predominantly countries that either produce raw materials or services inputs, research and development. Then there are countries that are a bit at the center of value chains, and they import to export. So they have both backward participation because they take inputs from others, and then forward participation because their product then continues the journey to be further processed in another country. And then there are, and so those are countries that specialize in the production of parts, components, semi-finished goods. And in some respect, Italy, a strong part of the industrial base in Italy is in this frame. And then there are countries that predominantly participate with what is called backward participation, meaning they're at the end of the chain. They might be in the assembly and in the export of finished goods, but using products and inputs produced by third countries. So when I will refer to forward and backward participation, I will be referring to this phenomenon. And then what we do normally with WDRs is that we always come up with a conceptual framework for each WDR, which is basically a picture that sort of describes the phenomenon and what we think is the so-called theory of change. And so this is our framework. So the main question, which we actually asked for a long time while we were preparing the report, was what is special about global value chains? In what are they different from arm's length trade, the trade that we've been used to see where just one country produces something and then exports it for consumption to another country. And well, we think that the 2 distinguishing features are hyper-specialization. So countries that do enter in global value chains or firms that enter into global value chains do not need to produce an entire product, but they specialize in a segment of this production, be it a good or a service. And this hyper-specialization also brings hyperscale. And I will come back to this concept afterwards, because it's actually giving way to one of the distortions of global value chains. But so it leads to hyper-specialization and hence hyperscale. And then the other important concept, which is actually something that we learned from sociologists, they were the first to speak about it, the school by Gary Gereffi in particular, is that we are dealing with firm-to-firm relationships. And that's fundamental. There is a fundamental difference in what happens in these firm-to-firm relationships compared to the traditional trade models. And what is this fundamental difference is that these firm-to-firm relationships tend to be long-term repeated interactions between trusted partners, while a lot of the traditional trade theory envisages the transaction as a spot transaction that is just determined by an assessment, a spot assessment of price and quantity. And so these firm-to-firm relationships and their permanent or persistent nature is really probably what also it's very important for development, because what it's allowed to do is to allow an unprecedented transfer of technologies between countries. And so, for instance, you have phenomena. I was talking yesterday with a colleague from Poland, and he wrote about a book about the development of Poland. Well, Poland, in the entire 1,000 years of their history, has never seen such a spectacular increase in know-how and per capita GDP as it has seen in the last 30 years by embracing global value chains, to the point that the per capita income is approaching the one of Italy. And that was in one generation, they've seen an unthinkable change in per capita GDP for that country. So what are the drivers of this engine of hyperspecialization and firm-to-firm relationships? The drivers are the usual ones of economic geography and trade. You need good endowments, you need good capital and good labor, you need market size, you need access to a large market, hence the importance of regional trade agreements. You need good, sound institutions, and the geography helps. So countries that are located closer to the core of global value chains, or regions within countries that are located close to the core of global value chain, they gain more than countries and regions that are more peripheral. And that it's a phenomenon that we see within countries and across countries. And these drivers, however, there are starting conditions. Let me get back to so they are starting conditions, but the main message also of the WDR is that the starting conditions along these drivers do not need to actually determine the future, because there are policies of openness, connectivity, and cooperation that actually can change some of the starting conditions. In terms of outcomes, so I will show in the next slides that global value chains have led to more growth and more jobs. And through that channel, because they increased the growth and they increased jobs, they allowed to reduce poverty. But at the same time, they heightened the inequality across many, many different dimensions, which I will talk about. And because of the hyperscale of production and the intensity of trade, they have also had environmental costs that we need to address. And so the main message is that while traditionally in development, an approach was let's first build and then we will think about cleaning up basically the distortions. I think the shocks, even the negative shocks, are so big. This in a mechanism orchestrated by global value chains that we can't afford to have this sequencing of policies. We need to build while also doing it in the right way, meaning with careful policies that take care of the social and environmental impacts. And so that's the main message and the main framework of the report. So Maurizio, how much time am I left with? Because I think I went a bit slow, and I want to see where to go a bit faster.
Tell you immediately, 1 second. You are 13 minutes. You have used 30 minutes, so you have 20 or so.
Okay, so now what we did, in fact, in the analysis, I said that it's important to talk about countries, but in fact, in the end, as Maurizio said, to understand what happened to countries, we need to look at firms. And so what we did as a proxy of global value chain participation, which is something somewhat difficult to measure because there is no statistical device that directly can track the flows, but one common standard to measure global value chains is to sort of differentiate between firms that do not trade, firms that export only and import only as a sign of more traditional trade, and firms that import and export as a sign of firms that are engaged in global value chains. Obviously, this is an upper bound definition, meaning it's exporting and importing is a necessary condition for being in a global value chain. Is a sufficient condition in many respects. It's not a necessary condition. There are firms that are engaged in global value chain by only exporting or only importing, as we saw, the ones that are at the beginning or at the end of the chain. But by and large, the majority of the firm will be exporting and importing. And so what do we see with these firms? We see that it doesn't matter which country we looked at, and we looked at Ethiopia, Vietnam, Mexico, some developed countries, and the aggregate of developing countries for which we had firm level data. And we see that the firms that both import and export are more productive of the rest of the firms. The bars here are the productivity differences with the non-trading firms in the country that are set at zero. So it's the marginal increase in productivity compared to the non-traders. And so we see this trend everywhere that basically exporters and importers are more productive than all other firms. We also saw, so another thing is, so there is Roderick that recently has said that there is something special about that very moment when firms do break into simple manufacturing from being exporters of commodity. And so we wanted to verify this hypothesis. And indeed, we found that it is true that incomes grow the most when countries break into simple manufacturing. Obviously, here there are also some base effects. I mean, they start from a smaller income level, and therefore the growth tends to be higher because of just the level effect. But there is also a message that you have the large scale the large scale effects that you have when you break into limited manufacturing. They are not reproduced in terms of incomes growth to more advanced stages. But moving into each more advanced stage still brings additional income growth. So this is the message of this slide. And then we asked, the other criticism of Roderick was, yes, but because these global value chains are capital intensive, because they employ more technology, the employment growth is dampened. So we verified also this phenomenon. And what we found is actually that it's true that firms that both import and export are more capital intensive, but because they are more capital intensive, they can produce at a larger scale, and hence the employment effect it's also positive. And I think that's the interesting twist and nuance which was missed by Roderick. And then we said, okay, and then what about poverty reduction? And so we find that indeed, if we looked at poverty reduction, the best way to look at it was within countries. And so we had data that allowed to do so for Vietnam, where we had the numbers of firms' total employment by region. and we could see the change in expenditure poverty rate. And so what we see is that the poverty reduction is indeed greater precisely in those regions of Vietnam where there are more firms that both import and export. So the additional criticism that we hear these days is, fine, this is a great story, but it's a story of the past. Now we have changes in technologies of production and of distribution, and therefore the newcomers to development might not actually be able to achieve the same income growth that we saw with the early adopters. And so another thing that we did in the WDR, which is now a paper by 3 colleagues, Bastos, Artuk, and Reichers, is that it is precisely, so what they did was to look at the adoption of industrial robots in the industrialized countries in the north of the world. And then they looked at imports of those countries for parts and components from the south of the world. And it is precisely in those sectors which were imported. And so here again, there is an income effect that probably is at play. And so we concluded that at least thus far, actually technology has not been a substitute to trade, but it has been a complement. We did the same exercise with other technologies and with other natural experiments that happened, and we found that this message continues to be true. But okay, so that's the positive story of globalization. But then another big part of the work was to look at what are the costs, because we really wanted to understand what are the economic roots of the discontent that we see. And so here a main message: increasing global value chain participation is associated with rising in developed countries, but so this is value chain participation into different countries, but falling markups in developing countries. So backward GVC participation in Japan, meaning Japan using parts and components from other countries, went up over the years. This is the textile sector, in a way that was extremely high correlated with the pattern of aggregate markup. And the measure of markup is from a famous paper by Jan de Locker.
Yeah, we lost
with the aggregate markup.
We lost for 5-6 seconds connection. So after you say the famous paper of the Locker,
yeah,
start from there.
Okay, so basically there is this famous paper of the Locker that computes aggregate markup. So what we did was actually to collaborate with Jan de Locker and to correlate these measures with the GVC participation. And we see that increased GVC participation backward by Japan, so adopting parts and components from other countries, including the South, is positively almost one-to-one correlated with the aggregate markups. So there has been an increase. There's been a one-on-one almost increase in GVC participation and the aggregate markup accruing to the Japanese firms. But the opposite is true with India. We see a very strongly negative correlation between forward GVC participation, being India a country that exports parts and components, meaning textiles and semi-finished textiles to other countries, for further processing and aggregate markups by the firms in the sector. And this is true. We saw this for all countries in the world. I put here Japan and India, but I could have put here, all countries in the world. We see that basically countries where firms are predominantly brands and so at the lead of a value chain tend to have the outlook of Japan, and countries that are suppliers into value chain tend to have the outlook of India, and it's true also for other sectors. Another point is that global value chains have contributed to the declining labor share within countries, both in high-income countries and in lower middle-income countries. However, the role of global value chains is not the most important, because domestic within industry factors read into this change in demand and change in technology have played a more important role in the decline of labor share within countries, and more demand as well, change in consumer preferences in third countries. The global value chains are also a mixed blessing for women. So on the one hand, those firms that both import and export tend to employ more female workers relative to non-global value chains. And this is true for both production workers and administrators or sales workers. But the probability of a female owner or a manager being at the helm of a complex firm, of a firm that both import and export, is lower than the probability that this is the case for a simpler firm that either doesn't trade or only imports or only export. And so we concluded that they don't break the glass ceiling. They help employment, but in lower ranking roles. But there is some kind of negative bias on the leadership of these firms. And finally, I think the most important story of all is this slide. And I think here there is a bit the betrayed promise of globalization. And this is a slide that, no, the next slide. This is just preparation of the slide that I wish I would have produced, but it's actually from someone else. And so the preparatory slide is that raising tax revenues is challenging in today's globalized world because of profits shifting and other practices. And predominantly because basically we have a nationally based taxation system that tries to deal with corporations that have an international footprint. And so corporate income taxes have declined by nearly 50% since 1990s. And even if the decline is bigger for OECD countries and the revenue loss is bigger for OECD countries, as a share of GDP, it is really hitting hard on developing countries. And here is the slide that, as I said, I wish I would have produced myself. This is from Egger, Nigel, and Strecker, a paper of 2019. And what this slide shows is that, on the top 1% and the corporate taxation are the purple lines. And you see that since 1980, they decreased steadily, both of them. And then the green line is actually the median worker, the median tax rate. And so we see that in 65 economies around the world, it has increased steadily. And this is really the missed or the failed promise of globalization, meaning that there was a bit of a discussion when all the measures to liberalize and to enable globalization started in the late 80s, and it was we liberalize, we create a system of production that is more efficient, that brings more growth. And we saw that that growth happened. And then with the second part should have been, and with the revenues of these additional revenues, we will redistribute it to compensate the losers. But because the taxation remains a purely national phenomenon, and that these companies have this global footprint, it is very difficult to tax the winners and compensate the losers. And so we do think that this is like a main reason why, you know, we see so much backlash from globalization, and one that we need to address head on. And then finally, on the environment, it's again a mixed blessing. I talked about the fact that, I mean, we ship parts and components across the world. Shipping has seen an unprecedented growth also associated with globalization, but there is excess transport, there is excess waste, and there are and some have hypothesized that there is the so-called pollution heaven effect, which means that harsher regulations in some countries, harsher environmental regulations in some countries just lead to a relocation of production in other countries. Actually, the pollution heaven effect, we haven't really seen it supported by the data thus far, but remain a theoretical possibility because it's a function of the amount and the harshness of the regulations. But those are the disadvantages. But then global value chains also bring other advantages because they allowed to produce, huge cost abatement on important environmental goods, solar panels, wind farms, and so on and so forth. And also because of the importance of lead firms from the north, where, you know, there are these regulations on environment at the helm of these global value chains, we also saw that they push standards upstream to all their supplier network. And so the diffusion of environmental practices is faster. And so the bottom line on the environment is that all the increase in pollution and waste that we're seeing is due to the hyper growth that was brought by, it's a scale effect, right? So we have, we have more growth, and as a result, we have also more pollution. But of all the possible ways of producing, perhaps global value chains are some that are advantageous because new practices can be transferred faster to the entire developing world. And so as a result of that, we also looked at, as an event study, we looked at the production related to CO2 emissions after a transition into global value chains. And we see that actually the more countries produce innovative activity and advanced manufacturing and services, the more the CO2 emissions are reduced. And for the countries breaking into limited manufacturing, there is so much variance that actually the effect, there is a positive increase in pollution, but is non-statistically significant, meaning there are countries that managed to break into limited manufacturing without seeing an increase in CO2 emissions. Okay, so these were just some additional numbers on what I just said. And so, okay, let me just try to conclude with a few policy slides, because I think I'm close to the end of my 20 minutes. So initially I said that the drivers of global value chain participation are geography, endowments, market sizes, and institutions, but the starting situation doesn't need to determine your destiny. And so we looked at what happens, different scenarios. So take sub-Saharan Africa, and we asked, what if Africa would reduce tariffs to the level of the best performer, which would be the ECA countries, then would see an increase in 13% of its GVC participation. If it would increase FDI to the level of the best performer, which is again ECA, it would see an increase in 16%. And then if it would increase the political stability to the level of the East Asia Pacific, which is the best performer, would see an increase in 8%. So there are sizable changes that can happen if policies are altered. And the main message is, however, that the policies do change according to the stage of development in which countries are. And so we have in the second part of the WDR, we really delve on all these policies, but just to make examples, if in the shift to limited manufacturing, we find that trade facilitation and transport liberalization reforms are particularly important, while for advanced manufacturing and services, skill development, technical and managerial practices become very important. And for innovative, for transitioning into innovative activities, a main agenda is the one on IPR protection and R&D capacity. And so the idea is that the development path, it's a journey, and the reforms are never a one-off, but it is a journey of reforms as well, and the objectives need to change all along the participation path, and that there is not a one-size-fits-all. In terms of the outcomes, I said the policies for social and environmental protection are important. So we have evidence that here I will just go fast on, but it's discussed in chapter 7 and 8 especially of the report, that can ensure benefits are shared and sustained. And so expanding adjustment assistance, supporting active labor, assist and retrain and to help with the job search and avoiding rigid labor market regulations. I mean, nothing new under the sun here. But one thing that we however saw is that really the best results are when the public sector works directly with firms, and so when I don't know, programs of transparency are enabled. And so here, for instance, we have just evidence from a program of the bank where they work with firms for improving health, safety, and standards in factories. And so the question was if you, I mean, in Vietnam and in Cambodia, this program decided to go into the practice of naming and shaming companies that were not implementing the changes. And so the question was, is it this excess of transparency useful or not? Do we end up having that the firms that do not want to improve the safety and health standards drop out of the programs, and the ones that remain in the program are only the ones that anyway would have changed those practices? And what we find actually is that no, this excessive transparency actually does help in improving practices, because we see that the non-compliance rates, they actually increase with the number of years a company is in the program, but they had a discrete jump when this new policy of public disclosure was announced, and an additional jump when it started being implemented. And so, conclusion, we think that, I mean, it's a bit of a long conclusion, but let me try to go fast. So we see that there are a lot of advantages in embracing global value chains for development, but there are also a lot of costs that we need to deal with. And a lot of the costs are in areas where actually the international cooperation is less optimal than we would wish. Because of the cost, however, we also saw that the multilateral trading system is under stress. And and the revival of this system will depend on deepening trade cooperation in areas where the business is unfinished, but also into extending cooperation in new areas, which I will mention in a minute. At the same time, I mean, this would be interesting, and I could spend another 20 minutes on this chart, but basically the bottom line is that at the same time, we were taking a step, an historical step, and we asked whether what we are seeing now in terms of tensions to the international trading system is something we saw before. And so we went back to the Pax Britannica, where the UK was the hegemon of international trade. And we saw that actually for the whole period of the Pax Britannica, when the UK had a share of wood export that was substantial, was above 20% and more, it acted as a benevolent master by enacting a lot of measures that would help globalization. And the same has happened to the US in the period after the Second World War. However, what is interesting is that the UK started departing from this policy of active policy of globalization at more or less the same moment when it experienced a similar decline in world export share as the US has been experiencing recently. And so basically this threshold is around 10%. So when no, sorry, 15%. And so at that point, at the time, the challenger was the US, and to a smaller degree, Germany. The UK departed from this embracement of globalization and started putting in place protective policies. And we saw that the same numbers led actually to the concerns on the US side about the value of the system of multilateral trade that has championed during the last 70 years. And so we were asking at the same time, is the threat to a rule-based system an historical inevitability? Okay, so we ended up a bit with this unanswered question, but our conclusion is that if we want trade to keep being a positive force for development, we need to finish the agenda on trade liberalization, and there are a number of important things that need to do. Developing countries should really consider whether special and differential treatment is serving them well. We don't think is necessarily the case. They should combat tariff escalation. They should keep reducing tariff and non-tariff barriers, especially in areas such as agriculture and service, where a lot of the development story can take place. And there should be stronger rules on subsidies and SOEs. At the same time, it's really important to look beyond trade if we are to keep trade open and beneficial. And so we need international agreement around taxes for the reasons I mentioned before, around competition, because we have a polarization and concentration of wealth in the hands of few firms, also helped by this hyper specialization and hyperscale that GVC enabled. And we need the cooperation in international data flows and on the environment. And with this, I'm concluding. Thanks so much.